She cemented my pool, on my property, because I wouldn't back down. I've never felt so disrespected in my own home. And what I did next changed the whole neighborhood. When I first pulled into the driveway of what would become my new home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. After 2 decades of working overtime, paying bills, raising kids, and grinding through the noise of life, I was finally in a place where the days moved a little slower, the air was just a little quieter, and the neighbors waved when they walked by. It was a quiet little suburb nestled just outside the city, where the streets were named after trees, and every house looked like it had been lifted from a catalog. Neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and perfectly spaced garden gnomes. Standing guard. Some might have found it boring. I found it comforting. The house itself wasn't anything extravagant, just a solid single story with enough space to breathe, a kitchen big enough for Sunday dinners, and a backyard that stirred a long-held dream I'd been nursing since my 30s, building my own little oasis with an in-ground pool. Not a mansion-style pool with a slide and waterfalls, just a simple, clean setup with a bit of landscaping, a privacy fence, and a couple of lounge chairs to sit back and forget the world for a while. So when the papers were signed and the keys were in my hand, I didn't waste time. I started drawing up plans, researching contractors, and filing all the necessary paperwork. City permits? Check. License builders? Check. I even went out of my way to ensure everything I did was up to code. No shortcuts, no gray areas. I wasn't just building a pool. I was reclaiming a small piece of joy. That's when I met her. Karen. Karen was the president of our homeowners association, a title she carried with the pride of a 5-star general. She wasn't elected so much as inherited her power, handed down from a predecessor who probably just wanted to escape the meetings. She was in her mid-50s, always wore pressed khakis and a pale blue visor, and had a voice that could slice drywall. But it wasn't the voice that got me. It was the way she looked at people, like they were children breaking rules she'd personally etched into stone. The first time we met, I was walking my dog. She stopped me mid-step and asked if I was the new resident on Birchwood. Not hi or welcome, just straight to business. I told her yes, and mentioned, casually, that I'd be starting construction on a small backyard pool. She didn't blink, just pursed her lips and said I wouldn't recommend it. When I asked why, she rattled off some vague statement about aesthetic consistency and community standards, even though there was nothing in the HOA bylaws that banned pools. I'd read them cover to cover, twice. Still, I tried to be respectful. I told her I appreciated her input, but that I had city approval and would follow every rule to the letter. That's when she leaned in a little too close and said, "Some things are better left unbuilt." It wasn't a warning. It was a threat wrapped in politeness. Now, I'm not a confrontational guy. I've spent most of my life avoiding conflict. But something about her tone, the way she acted like my dream didn't matter, lit a fire in me. I nodded, said thank you, and walked away. But inside, I made a decision. I wasn't backing down. I'd earned the right to that little piece of peace, and no one was going to take it from me. The construction began a few weeks later. Crews showed up early each morning, and I'd bring them coffee just to show appreciation. They worked hard, carefully, and respectfully. No mess, no loud music, no complaints from any of my neighbors. In fact, a few of them even came by to say how nice it was to see someone actually using their backyard. But not Karen. Karen showed up twice a day, clipboard in hand, taking pictures over my fence, walking the perimeter with a tape measure like she was planning an airstrike. One day, she flagged down a crew member and accused him of parking at a non-HOA approved angle. Another day, she filed a complaint claiming the temporary fence around the worksite was a visual blight. I documented everything, every visit, every ridiculous report, every phone call. At first, I laughed it off. I figured she'd get bored and move on once the pool was finished. But then the letters started coming. Thick, formally worded envelopes with the HOA's logo stamped across the front. Violation notices, fine threats, demands for immediate cessation of unauthorized construction. It didn't make sense. I had the permits. I had followed every regulation. Still, I responded respectfully, sent copies of my approvals, and kept moving forward. But with every letter, the language became more aggressive, and the fines became more outrageous. She started threatening legal action, eviction, and even property seizure. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. This was a full-on assault on my right to enjoy my own home. And through it all, I kept wondering, why? What kind of person sees someone building something peaceful and decides it's their mission to destroy it? That question stayed with me every time I stood in that half-finished backyard, staring at what was supposed to be my sanctuary. I started to feel the weight of it, not just the stress, but the disrespect. It wasn't about concrete or tiles anymore. It was about dignity, about standing your ground when someone tries to push you out of your own life. If you've ever had someone try to make you feel small in your own home, you know exactly what I mean. And if you're the kind of man who believes in standing up for what's right, even when it's inconvenient, then I invite you to subscribe. Because this isn't just my story. It's one of many. And every week, I share true stories of people who refuse to be silenced, no matter the odds. These are stories about justice, about reclaiming dignity, and about the quiet power of standing your ground. So if that resonates with you, hit subscribe and stay with me. Because what happened next turned my entire world upside down. One morning, just days before the final tile was set, I came home early from work and heard a cement mixer rumbling in my backyard. The days that followed the start of construction felt like a strange mix of hope and quiet dread. Every morning I'd walk outside, coffee in hand, to check on the crew and the progress. And every morning, almost without fail, there she was, Karen. Standing a few feet away from my property line like some self-appointed border patrol, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, snapping pictures like she was gathering evidence for a federal case. It was surreal. The workers, good honest guys just doing their jobs, started to notice too. At first they thought she was maybe a building inspector. When I told them she was just the HOA president, they laughed. But that laughter didn't last long. She was relentless. One day she walked right up to the foreman and demanded he show her a copy of the drainage plan. He just stared at her, confused. She wasn't from the city, had no badge, no authority, but she acted like the queen of code enforcement. I told her politely to leave the crew alone. She responded by filing a formal disruption of community tranquility complaint, whatever that means. I tried to keep calm. I really did. Every time she filed another report or flagged some imaginary violation, I documented it. I had a folder on my desk labeled Karen, filled with time-stamped photos, copies of my permits, and every HOA letter she sent. I even started recording some of our conversations just in case things escalated. But even with all the evidence on my side, the emotional toll was starting to creep in. I was waking up in the middle of the night thinking about fence measurements and landscaping ordinances. My joy, this dream of a backyard oasis, was slowly being poisoned by stress and frustration. And yet, the construction moved forward. The crew stayed focused. We installed the pool walls, poured the base, tiled it in a subtle slate blue that matched the house trim, and landscaped around it with low-maintenance plants and a couple of solar lights. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just peaceful, private, and mine. But Karen wasn't done. One afternoon, she came by holding a level and a color swatch, claiming that the pool tiles I used were overly reflective and could pose a visual hazard to drivers passing the property. I nearly choked on my water. Drivers? From where? The road was 2 lots away and blocked by trees. It didn't matter. She filed another complaint. This time she called an emergency HOA board meeting, and though no one else showed up, because no one else ever cared enough to attend, she took minutes, signed them herself, and then emailed me a copy demanding immediate aesthetic correction. I didn't know whether to laugh or lose my mind. Still, I held the line. I replied respectfully, pointed to the city-approved permits, and went on about my business. I wasn't about to let a power-hungry neighbor derail something I had built the right way, with integrity and patience. I told myself she'd burn out. Eventually, that she'd lose interest once the construction dust settled and the sound of jackhammers stopped echoing through the block. But she didn't fade. She doubled down. Just days before the final inspection, I came home to find a bright orange notice posted on my front door. Unapproved structure. Remediation required. It wasn't from the city. It was from the HOA, signed by Karen. No board member signatures, no vote record. Just her. I called the HOA hotline. It went straight to voicemail. Her voicemail. That's when I realized there was no board. Not really. Just her. She'd scared off or outlasted everyone else, and now wielded the HOA bylaws, like her own personal weapon. I emailed her, formally requesting the names and contact information of the active board members. She replied with a single line. All correspondence will be routed through the president. That was it. I felt like I was living in a bad political drama. My blood pressure was through the roof. I couldn't eat. My hands would shake every time I saw her stupid blue visor bobbing past my kitchen window. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about principle. About standing up for your right to live in peace without someone trying to control your every move. And yet, I stayed respectful. I stayed the course. I focused on finishing the pool. I thought, if I can just get to the end, maybe she'll stop. And then, finally, it was done. The workers packed up their tools, shook my hand, and left me standing at the edge of something I'd waited years to enjoy. That night I grabbed a cold drink, kicked off my shoes, and slipped into the water. It was perfect. The sky was clear, the stars were out, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Floating there on my back, staring up into the night, I thought, I made it. I fought for this. I won. And for a moment I believed it. But I didn't realize that Karen wasn't just trying to block my project, she was planning to destroy it. Because while I floated in that pool feeling proud and free, she was already on the phone, not with the city, not with another neighbor, but with a contractor, one who specialized in concrete. A few days later, I would come home early from work and find a cement truck in my driveway, and the sound of wet concrete being pumped into the pool I had fought so hard to build. I pulled into my driveway that afternoon feeling tired, but looking forward to a quiet evening, maybe a cold beer by the pool, finally enjoying the place I had fought so hard to build. But then something caught my eye. A massive cement truck, parked right in front of my house, engine humming softly. My first thought was that maybe a neighbor was having some work done, so I shrugged it off and started walking toward my backyard, only to freeze when I noticed a thick hose snaking around the side of my house, disappearing through the gate into my yard. Panic shot through me like lightning. I dropped my keys and sprinted toward the gate, heart pounding so loudly I thought the neighbors might hear it. When I pulled open the gate, I saw the unimaginable, my brand new pool, the one I'd poured my savings, sweat, and dreams into, was slowly being filled with wet, heavy concrete. Two men in grimy overalls stood there, calmly guiding the hose as the gray sludge swallowed the blue tiles and pristine water lines, like an unstoppable wave. I couldn't contain myself. I screamed at them, voice raw and desperate. "What the hell are you doing?" One man glanced at his clipboard, then back at me with a blank expression and said, "We're just following work orders. HOA directive, right?" Confusion and fury collided in my chest. I felt like the ground beneath me was cracking open. Before I could react further, Karen appeared, striding up from her golf cart with that smug look that had haunted me from day one, arms crossed like she owned the entire street. She looked like she was about to steal Christmas. That's how cruel and triumphant she seemed. "You were warned," she said in that cold, clipped voice. "The HOA board voted. The pool violates community standards." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't some small misunderstanding or a dispute to be settled in court. It was outright destruction sanctioned by a self-appointed tyrant who had turned a neighborhood association into her personal dictatorship. I yelled at the workers to stop, pleading that this was my private property, my investment, my peace, but they just shook their heads, pointing to their orders. "No halt order, no stop," they said, their tone bureaucratic and indifferent. I grabbed my phone and dialed the city's emergency number, breath shaking as I tried to explain the situation, begging for immediate intervention. But the concrete kept flowing, thick and merciless, swallowing every inch of the pool, sealing away years of hope under a solid gray tomb. By the time the authorities finally arrived, it was too late. The pool was ruined, filled with concrete, useless, dead. Thousands of dollars flushed down the drain, but worse than the money was the feeling of violation, the deep, sinking betrayal. I stood there, helpless, watching what should have been my sanctuary become a monument to injustice. I felt stripped of control, dignity shredded by the very system that was supposed to protect our community's values. My dream wasn't just crushed, it was deliberately destroyed. And as I stared at the cold, hard concrete where my pool once sparkled, I realized this fight wasn't just about water and tiles anymore. It was about standing up against a force, willing to trample everything I valued, everything I had earned. The worst part? Karen was already planning her next move. I stood in my backyard that evening, staring at the solid gray slab where my pool used to be, feeling the kind of numb anger that doesn't make you shout, it makes you act. I could have broken down right there, dropped to my knees in defeat, but instead, something inside me snapped into focus. I wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about something deeper, something sacred. It was about the basic dignity of a man working hard, playing by the rules, and still getting steamrolled by someone on a power trip. I walked into the house, sat down at my kitchen table, and started building my case. I gathered every permit, every signed approval from the city, every email I had sent and received from the HOA. I compiled photos of the pool construction, timestamps, records of inspections. I even had the original design sketches and the stamped approval from the zoning department. By the time I called my lawyer, I had a binder thick enough to stop a bullet. I didn't want revenge, I wanted justice, and I wanted the truth exposed. My lawyer, an old-school, no-nonsense guy who had handled more HOA disputes than he cared to admit, took one look at my stack of evidence and said, "Son, this isn't just a case, this is a reckoning." Turns out, Karen hadn't just overstepped her authority, she'd outright broken the law. The HOA never had a board vote. In fact, several board members had no idea what had happened until I reached out. There were no official meeting minutes, no signed approvals, nothing. Karen had taken it upon herself to fabricate documents, bypass, process, and issue what looked like an official order, all with her own signature. When we filed the lawsuit, we didn't just target the HOA, we targeted Karen directly. A formal cease and desist letter was sent to her home, and another to the HOA. The reaction was instant. Karen, who had strutted around the neighborhood like she owned the place, suddenly went silent. But what happened next was something I didn't see coming. One by one, neighbors began stopping by my house, not to complain, but to thank me. An older gentleman down the street told me Karen had once fined him for leaving his garage door open for 10 minutes. A single mom 2 blocks over said her child's inflatable backyard pool had been reported as a visual hazard. Another neighbor told me she came home one year to find her Christmas decorations removed from her lawn, without warning. The stories kept coming. Flower beds destroyed because they weren't native plants. Fences repainted because the shade of brown was too warm. One guy even said his American flag had been taken down because it wasn't on an HOA-approved pole. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. Karen hadn't been serving the neighborhood. She had been controlling it. And now, people were finally realizing they weren't alone. I wasn't the only one she'd steamrolled. What began as my personal fight was becoming something much bigger. We called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would people actually show up? Would they care? That night, the room was packed. Standing room only. I saw familiar faces, tired faces, faces that looked like mine. People who just wanted peace, order, fairness. My lawyer stood with me as I laid out everything. The forged vote, the illegal destruction of private property, the fabricated documentation, and the testimonies of a dozen neighbors. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The truth did all the heavy lifting. When Karen walked in late, her face tight and lips pressed into a thin line, the energy in the room shifted. She looked around, and for the first time, realized the tide had turned. She tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but every word landed with a thud. People weren't buying it anymore. When the vote to remove her was called, hands shot up across the room, nearly unanimous. Karen was officially voted out as HOA president in under 10 minutes. No applause, no shouting, just a quiet, collective exhale from a neighborhood finally taking back its dignity. She stood there for a moment, stunned, as if the power had been yanked out from under her. That smug smile, the one she wore every time she handed out a fine or snapped a photo of someone's front lawn. It was gone. And in its place was something I hadn't expected. Fear. She knew what was coming. The lawsuit would continue. The city was already investigating the unauthorized destruction of my pool. There would be consequences. Real ones. But beyond the legal victories and personal vindication, something even more important had happened. Our neighborhood woke up. People started talking again, sharing, helping. We created a new community board, this time with actual transparency. Neighbors who had barely nodded at each other before were now stopping to chat during evening walks. One guy even offered to help rebuild part of my backyard, free of charge. Another donated landscaping supplies. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. And as I stood in my yard days later, with the cement slab still there but the burden beginning to lift, I knew something had shifted in me too. I wasn't just a homeowner fighting off a bully. I was a man standing up for something bigger. For dignity, for fairness, for the right to live peacefully without being harassed or humiliated on your own property. And just when I thought things might be settling, my lawyer walked in with news that would change everything. 6 months. That's how long it took from the day I stood in my backyard staring at a pool full of cement to the day I walked out of the courthouse with the ruling in my hand and a quiet, steady feeling in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The lawsuit dragged on with all the twists and paperwork you'd expect, but I never backed down. I kept showing up, kept submitting every document, every photo, every signed permit, and every statement from the neighbors who had come forward. The judge didn't just listen, he looked closely, and when the verdict came down, it was clear and firm. I won. Karen had not only overstepped, she had broken the law. Her unilateral actions, the forged paperwork, the destruction of private property, all of it came to light in a courtroom full of people who had once whispered their frustrations behind closed doors. Now they were nodding, eyes wide with quiet justice as the judge ruled that Karen would be held personally liable for the cost of the damages to my property. She was ordered to pay restitution out of her own pocket, not the HOA's, because she had acted alone, without a legitimate vote, and against the rules she claimed to uphold. It wasn't just money. She was barred from ever holding an HOA office again anywhere, a permanent stain on her civic record. And then, something I didn't expect, the HOA under its new leadership issued a formal apology, not just to me, but to every single homeowner she had bullied, fined, or intimidated over the years. It was read aloud in a community meeting, signed by every board member, and distributed in writing. For the first time in 2 years, I saw heads held high, neighbors shaking hands, people exchanging real smiles that had nothing to do with fear or forced pleasantries. As for my pool, the HOA paid for the cement to be professionally removed. It took weeks, and a specialized crew had to be brought in to break it up without causing more damage, but when it was finally cleared, I stood there with a shovel in my hand and a renewed sense of ownership. This time I didn't just rebuild, I made it better. I added features I'd only dreamed of before. A stone waterfall that created a gentle, soothing sound at night, LED lighting that gave the whole yard a soft glow, and a fire pit that became the center of family gatherings, quiet evenings, and the kind of peace that only comes when you fought for something and earned it back. That first night back in the water, floating on my back, staring up at the stars, I didn't just feel like a man with a pool. I felt like a man who'd taken his life back from something that had tried to steal it in pieces. And Karen? She was gone 2 months later, packed up, moved out, and put her house on the market without so much as a goodbye. Word around the block was she couldn't handle the looks, the silence, or the fact that her power had vanished. No one waved as her moving truck pulled away. There was no party, no farewell committee, just the quiet sound of a neighborhood healing. And here's the truth. The kind that matters more than any courtroom win or repair bill. Dignity isn't just about holding your head high when things are going well. It's about standing firm when someone tries to knock you down for no reason other than they can. It's about refusing to be bullied, even when the bully wears a pastel blazer and carries a clipboard instead of fists. It's about remembering that justice, real justice, isn't loud or vengeful. It's patient, persistent, and unshakable. I've had neighbors thank me, even call me brave. But I don't see it that way. I just see a man who didn't back down, who knew what was right and who was willing to walk the long road to get there. And I'll tell you, it's a strange kind of beauty to sit in a chair by your rebuilt pool, hear the waterfall trickling in the background, and know that every brick, every light, every flame dancing in that fire pit stands on a foundation you refuse to let someone else destroy. The process wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, but it was worth every single step. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this. Don't let anyone take what's yours. Not your peace, not your dignity, not your right to live in the home you've built with your own two hands. Document everything, stay calm, and never let fear decide your next move. You don't need to shout to be strong. Sometimes strength is quiet. It's a man showing up every day, even when he's tired, even when he's angry, and saying, no more. That's how you win, not with rage, but with resolve. And now, every time I float in that pool and look up at the same stars that watched me through the worst of it, I feel something deeper than victory. I feel peace. And if this story meant something to you, if you've ever faced someone who tried to push you around, take what was yours, or strip you of your dignity, then remember this. Bullies only win when good people stay silent. But when you stand firm, stay respectful, and fight back with truth on your side, justice has a way of finding its way home. You don't need to shout to be heard, you just need to hold your ground. And if stories like this speak to you, if you value justice, dignity, and standing up for what's right, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. There are more real stories coming, stories that matter, stories that fight for the truth, and stories that remind us that we're never too old to stand up and say, enough, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next one.